COVID-19 and the economic downturn is putting governments in difficult fiscal status. From one side, the revenue is shrinking, and from the other side, their expenditure is increasing, and they need to pay more for healthcare expenditures and also transfer payments and so on. So this is the reason that it shows the importance of having this meeting in order to bring experts, senior level experts from academia and also from governments and financial sector in order to discuss about the solutions. So today we have these distinguished speakers that kindly accepted this invitation for joining this joint event, which is a joint event of Tokai University, Yonsei University, and Climate Bond Initiative. And let me start this webinar by inviting Vice Chancellor of Tokai University, Professor Naoto Yoshikawa, for delivering his welcoming remarks. Professor Yoshikawa, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, but some of maybe in the early morning. And Professor Tijon Lee, Professor Yoshino, Dr. Kuan Yo, distinguished guests, and colleagues. It gives me great pleasure as a Vice Chancellor of the Tokai University to welcome you to this webinar, virtual workshop today. The theme for today's workshop is Physical and Environmental Sustainability in the Post-COVID-19, which is currently one of the most important subjects of our globalized world. In today's world, the COVID-19 pandemic is severely affecting the financial status of all governments. On one hand, government incomes are reducing as economic downturns affect shrinking tax revenues. On the other hand, government expenditures are substantially increasing as government needs to spend more on healthcare and provide the necessary protection measures for business, including transfer payment. For example, this year, the Japanese government is spending significant funds for healthcare and introducing several stimulus schemes for its economy, such as cash payment to its people and financial contributions to the corporate sector. Due to these supportive policies and enormous spending, the Japanese government's fiscal status is challenging. The Japanese government may mobilize more than 60 trillion yen for countermeasure of the COVID-19. This is not the case only for Japan. Similar cases can also be seen in many other countries in Asia and other regions. Considering the present situation, it is vital to look for sound policies that can secure economic growth in the post-COVID-19 world, and at the same time, reduce budget deficit and recreate a healthy fiscal status, which makes financial stability. This is a first objective of today's webinar. This webinar's second objective is to discuss how to achieve environmental sustainability and sustainable development using a fiscal policy for mid to long-term goals. I believe that fiscal policy has an essential role in assuring the sustainable use of resources and conserving environment. This applies to both sides of the government budget, which is revenue and expenditure. For example, on the revenue side, carbon taxation and green bonds are two essential tools. On the expenditure side, tax cuts and subsidies can encourage investments in the environment-friendly project. Today, we have distinguished speakers who are senior government officials and senior experts from the academia and the financial sector, and also experts of energy and environmental economics, who will discuss their latest findings on fiscal policy's role in achieving sustainable development. I am confident that today's workshop will allow all the participants to deepen their understanding of the fiscal policy and fiscal policy's role for sustainable development. But moreover, I hope that today's workshop will be practically useful for fiscal policy making and a trigger for further reading research for this field for all participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yoshikawa, for your welcoming remarks. So next, we will have a presentation by Professor Tae-Jung Lee, Dean of College of Government and Business of Yonsei University, Republic of Korea. So unfortunately, he had another engagement, so he couldn't join, but his presentation is by a recorded video that let me play. Just a moment, please.
Hello everyone. It's my pleasure and honor to make opening remarks for the conference on the fiscal and environmental sustainability in the post-COVID-19. And this is very timely subject to discuss. And also the issues presented today are closely related to the sustainable development goals set by the United Nations. And I find that the speakers today are virtually from all over the world, from East Asia, from Europe, and also from the Central America. And this reflects the fact that we have to work together to deal with the environmental problems and also the fiscal problems. The fiscal sustainability used to be individual countries' problem, but it is not anymore, I believe. So in the middle of the pandemic, we have to discuss in advance how we are going to deal with the fiscal responsibility in the post-COVID-19, and also the serious environmental threats that we have to live with. So I congratulate all of the participants on this very valuable and timely conference. And I hope that we can learn a lot from your discussions, and I hope that we find better solutions for our problems in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thanks to the Dean for his welcoming remarks. So next we will have two keynote speech. So for our attendees and participants, I just shared the agenda, the link of agenda and the biography of the speakers in the chat panel. So this is accessible if you want to see the agenda and bio of the speakers, it's available there. Next, I would like to invite Professor Naoyuki Yoshino. Professor Naoyuki Yoshino is Professor Emeritus of Keio University in Japan. Presently, he's Director of Financial Research Center of FSA Institute in Government of Japan. And he's also visiting professor of GRIPS in Tokyo, and he was lead chair of T20, G20 Japan. So his keynote speech is on optimal fiscal policy for fiscal sustainability in the post-COVID-19. Professor Yoshino, please.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me today. And I would like to thank Vice Chancellor Yoshikawa for a very nice presentation. So I would like to show my slides. Can you see my slides?
Would you please share your screen?
Screen, okay. Can you see now?
Just a moment, it is coming. Yeah, it's clear now. And
clear?
If you make it full screen, it's better.
Yeah. I try to make it full screen. But is it okay if I start?
Yeah, it is clear.
Okay.
Please kindly start. Yeah.
Okay, so this paper is going to talk about the conditions of fiscal sustainability and fiscal stability. Traditionally, DOMA condition, which compares interest rate and growth rate of the economy, became very popular even today. However, I'm going to show that DOMA condition, which compares interest rate and growth rate of the economy, only applies to United States. And all other countries, we have to look at different conditions for sustainability of fiscal budget. And that is my main message. And then the first, I would like to talk about traditional DOMA condition, which compares interest rate and growth rate of the economy. And I would like to show why it does not apply to Japan and Greece and other countries. Next, I would like to compare Greece and Japan. Japanese debt to GDP ratio is bigger than Greece. But Greece went into bankrupt, Japan is still sustained. And it is not coming from DOMA condition. Important part of the stability is demand for government bonds. So I'm going to talk about supply and demand for government bonds, and I'm going to obtain the new conditions for stability. Because many countries started to look at comparison between interest rate and growth rate of the economy, especially in Southeast Asia and Asia. So I'm going to talk about it is not enough. Please look at the DOMA condition. First equation, G plus R times B. This is total government spending, including interest payment. G is general government spending. R times B, T minus 1, is the interest payment for budget deficits. And that has to be financed by tax revenues and new issue of government bonds. So this is the government budget constraint. And DOMA condition is going to look at whether this bond will keep on rising, or this bond issue will be converged. And that is the DOMA condition. So he obtains his own condition by dividing both hands by GDP and then rearranging this government budget constraint will obtain the second equation. BT minus 1, small b, this is budget deficits divided by GDP. Then small gt and TT, this is also divided by GDP. Large G divided by GDP and tax revenue divided by GDP. Then we'll obtain the coefficient for the BT minus 1. So if we look at this left-hand side, RT is interest rate and eta T is growth rate of the economy. If RT is greater than eta T, and this will keep on rising, this is situation. So accumulated bond will become bigger and bigger. And if interest rate is smaller than growth rate of the economy, this is less than 1, so the budget deficit will converge. This is a very famous DOMA condition, and everybody follows of this condition, interest rate and growth rate of the economy. Recently, modern monetary theory, MMT, is talking about Japan is okay because RT is negative interest rate. And even if growth rate of the economy in Japan is not so high, central bank can set interest rate as low as possible. So Japan do not have to worry about budget deficits as long as central bank can control this interest rate. That is MMT, new monetary, modern monetary theory. But that is not true. Furthermore, Krugman and Tirol are also talking about the comparison between interest rate and growth rate of the economy. So they are also talking about if central bank can lower the interest rate, then this DOMA condition is always satisfied so that budget deficits will not explode. So those are the common view about the fiscal sustainability. And we have seen in many countries after COVID-19. As Vice Chancellor Yoshikawa mentioned, fiscal deficits are growing. And many countries are worrying about their sustainability of the budget by looking at DOMA condition, interest rate and growth rate of the economy. Then modern monetary theory is talking about Japan can be sustained. Okay, this is the bond market. I'm comparing left-hand side is Japan, right-hand side is Greece. In both countries, vertical axis is the issue of new government bonds. Whatever the interest rate is, government has to issue government bond. So a new issue of government bond is shifting to the right, Japanese case and Greece case. And upward sloping curve, this upward sloping curve is demand for government bond because I'm measuring interest rate as vertical axis. If we measure price, the demand curve is downward sloping. But in this figure, I'm measuring interest rate on vertical axis. So demand for government bond is upward sloping. In case of Greece, demand has shrunk significantly when Greece was hit by crisis. So demand curve shift to the left because lots of the investors came from overseas. Japanese case, most of the demand comes from domestic investors and domestic individuals. In Japanese case, this interest rate this demand curve was shifting to the right because deposit, insurance, pension funds were growing. so interest rate became smaller and smaller. Most recently, this green line is the purchase by Central Bank of Japan by open market operations. So Central Bank of Japan achieved negative interest rate. Central Bank is the only institution which can make interest rate negative. So our interest rate is set to negative range because Central Bank does not matter whatever the interest rate is. So this green shift is now coming from Central Bank of Japan, purchasing government bonds and supplying huge amount of money into the market. So these two diagrams, left-hand side is Japan, right-hand side is Greece, because demand has shifted to the left. So that means interest rate will go up significantly. But Japanese case, because of demand is shifting to the right, so interest rates were very stable. This figure shows the comparison between Greece, Japan, and several other countries. In 2011 and 12, Greece was hit by financial crisis because of debt issue, and interest rate went up 35%. And interest burden became very large, and demand has shifted, so Greece went into bankrupt. Bottom line is Japanese case. Interest rates were the lowest among all the countries in the world, and it was very stable. And most recently, it hit negative range. That is this figure. So we have to always think about supply of government bonds and demand for government bonds. Krugman's equation only comes from supply of government bonds. Because US government bonds, everybody wants to buy, especially in crisis, US bond becomes very attractive. So US government does not have to worry about demand for government bonds. That is why DOMA condition applies to the United States. However, Japan, Greece, Korea, and other countries, we have to think about supply and demand because our currency is not global currency. And our government bonds are not sold to everywhere. So we have to think about supply and demand. Then next, I would like to compare left-hand side Japan and right-hand side Greece in 2011 figures. Japanese case, domestic investor was 95% and overseas investors were only 5%. So in other words, 95% of demand came from domestic market. On the other hand, Greece bond market, only 1/3 came from domestic investors and 2/3 came from overseas investors. So that is this figure. Overseas investors are very easy to shift, sell their bonds into the market, and then they can go back to their own home country or invest into US Treasury bonds. So demand by foreign investors are very fragile in many countries. So that in Greece case, demand shifted significantly to the left, and which means interest rate went up very high. And that was this situation here. So we have to take into account of supply and demand in order to construct stability condition. So I set it up simple model, demand for government bonds and a supply of government bonds and demand for government bonds. And in government budget constraint, I combined fiscal sector and monetary central bank. So issue of central bank money supply is within widened fiscal government budget constraint, which include central bank money supply. And this is the demand for government bonds. Then we can construct supply and demand and come up to the bond supply and bond demand equations. Then from these simultaneous equations of supply and demand, we can obtain the sustainability condition of this form. So sustainability condition depends on the existing stock of government bonds and interest rate sensitivity of the demand for government bonds. Intuitive explanation is 1 unit of change is the interest rate. Then interest burden will become higher, R times existing stock of bond. Then government bond has to be issued by that amount. And B1 is interest rate sensitivity of the demand for government bonds. If the demand for government bonds will become bigger than interest rate burden, then government deficits will converge. On the other hand, if demand is smaller than interest burden payment, then budget deficits will rise. So we can draw these conditions on the left-hand side and right-hand side. This compares large B, it is existing stock bond, and small b1 is interest rate sensitivity of the demand for bonds, and F1 is interest rate sensitivity of foreign investors. And if foreign investors becomes larger and larger, then they are very fast to shift from their bonds to overseas bonds. That will reduce the demand drastically. So based on this simultaneous equation, we obtained new fiscal sustainability condition, which is consisting of both supply and demand, and large B divided by small b. Then I applied together with Mr. Miyamoto, who will be presenting a paper later, to Japan and Greece case by using our formula. Then it is clearly show Japanese case, this yellow line is higher than blue line, which shows stability of the bond market. Then Greece case, blue line has exceeding this yellow line, which is the bankrupt and unsustainability of government bond market. So our analysis by using demand and supply, and also applying our data by looking at Greece and Japan, it identifies our new condition for sustainability applies in Japan and Greece in both cases. So in other words, we have to take into account of supply and demand all the time in order to keep sustainability of the budget deficits, rather than looking at DOMA condition, which compared interest rate and growth rate of the economy. Then Chinese government has looked at my condition, and they asked me, how would it be possible to apply to local government sustainability? Central Bank of China is very much concerned about fiscal sustainability of local government. So I applied our model to local government fiscal conditions. Local government has transfer of money from central government. And some of the tax revenues are not staying in local government, and it were absorbed by central government. And then we obtained the new conclusions of the local government sustainability. Even at the local government level, our analysis applies. Supply of local government bonds and demand for local government bonds. And that will provide us the sustainability condition for local government. So this is the case of local government, and we should look at the sustainability, looking at interest rate sensitivity of the demand, and also existing stock of local government bonds. So those are our main results. And this paper, especially empirical part, my co-author, Mr. Miyamoto, who is presenting another paper, has estimated these coefficients for Greece and Japan. So that's all my presentation. So in other words, many Asian countries, especially who are facing with huge budget deficits, they should not just look at DOMA condition. which compares interest rate and growth rate of the economy. And China is also worrying about their budget deficits in the local government. So supply and demand, simultaneous equation, and which becomes this large B and small b. This comparison is the true stability condition for the budget. And I hope many Asian countries can follow this formula rather than looking at DOMA condition, which only applies to United States. And especially this is very important after COVID-19. Indonesian government was looking at interest rate and growth rate of the economy. So I'm talking about you have to look at demand for government bonds. At the same time, supply of government bonds. Those are my presentation. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor Yoshino, for the interesting presentation on fiscal sustainability using the revised DOMA condition. So it was very interesting. So our next keynote speaker is Dr. Kwangyo Liu, who is the visiting fellow at Asia Research Institute of Yonsei University. Professor Dr. Yu was senior government official. He was the senior deputy governor at Korea FSS, which is the supervisor and regulator of the Korean financial system. So Dr. Yu will present on the Korea's new green initiative to sustain the economy. Dr. Yu, please.
Thank you, Dr. Farhad, and thank you for the invitations. Let me give us a few seconds to open my presentations. It is my honor to have a chance to give a snapshot on Korea's path towards green economy. It's more of a descriptive analysis as we make some remarkable progress in just a few months. And fiscal now financial policymakers and regulators also joined the move in supporting green transitions. Before I start, I must tell you that it was yesterday when the President Moon announced Korea's commitment to carbon net zero by 2050 in his congressional address, which is a big step forward from Korea's point of view. You know that Korea is heavily dependent on fossil fuel for their industrial developments and management. So keep in mind, my presentation cannot reflect those recent turnarounds of the remarks by the presidents to commit ourselves to the global society. Let me start with the backgrounds. It was 2008 when former President Mr. Lee adopted green growth agenda as part of economic and political agendas. At that time, since the premature external environments and domestic industrial structures, green agenda remained short-lived despite a strong drive by the government. However, in terms of assessment, there was some progress in terms of building up green infrastructures. We set up legal and institutional base. We hosted Green Climate Fund in Incheon, international organization focusing on green finance. We also established Green Technological Center. We also prepared emission trading system, which was implemented in 2015. However, heavy reliance on fossil fuel and legitimate opposition from the industrial sector was main impediments to go forward with those green economy policies. However, a decade later, and more recently, we began to see a dramatic turnaround and development from external side, and we now see some tangible fruit in domestic sides. The first and most important move is ironical, but came from the COVID-19 driven pressures. While it's not clear to me, at least, the relationship between pandemic and climate change, but pandemic and following economic crisis resulted in Korean New Deal fiscal package to address, one hand, economic difficulties, on the other hand, the transformation to sustainable economy. And that turns out to be the crystallizing green transition in my assessment. Indeed, there have been some pressures building up in the public domain. Paris Cup in 2015 and following global move in financial sectors, global sectors have been steady and strong. NGFS, Network for Greening Financial System. This is a group of central bank and financial regulators, and TCFD, a task force on climate-ready financial disclosure, mainly engineered by the IOSCO, and G20 study group on climate finance were examples. And 2019 European Green Deal, I think, is a big step forward for European perspective by announcing also 2050 net zero carbon targets, and its action plans applied pressure on global and Korean society as well. Sorry. While US Green Deal expressing its intention to net zero carbon emission by 2030, which was very adamant, was not able to implementable because of the presidential elections. But we have to see how, a few days later, how things will turn around, whether Democratic president or Republican presidents. An early 100 campaign was widely supported, joined by major international companies, Google, Apple, Microsoft, British Telecom, JP Morgan Chase, to name a few. And some major Korean companies now follow the campaign. We also know that China, President Xi, declared carbon net zero move by 2060. And I also heard Japanese Prime Minister Mr. Suga made the same commitments by 2050 recently. And as I mentioned, Korea also made a similar commitments yesterday. At the same time, private pressure has been building up. Board and management at the company level are getting more aware of the ESG issues. Major investment banks and insurance companies commit to fossil-free asset allocations. And many major asset companies such as BlackRock and Fidelity are now changing the way the companies and financial sectors to operate by urging them to disclose their activities toward ESG, including fossil-free investments. Domestic pressure has been also rising too. Korea hosting P4G summit, though postponed due to coronavirus, was one of the big events that we can take advantage of in order to accelerate transition towards green economy. Sorry. And some local premises, in the case Korea, declared to shut down coal power plant in their regions by 2050s. Some pension funds decided to stay away from investment on fossil-dependent industries. And National Assembly now led the discussion to provide legal basis for this purpose. To summarize, the relative cost of using carbon becomes much more expensive than before. And in this context, Korea's Green Deal has deeper employment and structural implications down the road. Let me briefly introduce Korea's Green New Deal, which was announced July 14th of this year as part of economic recovery package. The government decided to mobilize 160 trillion Korean won, which is equivalent to 30% of government budget to support recovery and structural transformation for the next 5 years. Just put a focus on Green New Deal. Green New Deal aims at the green transformation economy and society towards carbon net zero society. And the target was set yesterday. And government decided to mobilize 73 trillion Korean won, more than half of total package, to create 660,000 related jobs for the next 5 years. Before that Korean New Deal, the government commitments was quite naive, to be honest. We have 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, which is reducing 37% of the greenhouse gas emissions as to 2030 business as usual, which is equivalent to 24% cut as to 2017 level of the greenhouse gas emissions. And also we have a renewable energy 30-20 plan, which is to increase the share of the renewable energy to 20% in electricity by 2030. And this is subject to modification down the road. Korea's Green New Deal consists of three building blocks. And first one is green transition of infrastructure with 12 trillion won. First, turning public facility into zero energy buildings. And second, restoring terrestrial and marine and urban ecosystem. And third, smart management of water system. And second building block for Green New Deal is low carbon and decentralized energy system with 24 trillion won. First, building a smart grid for efficient energy management. The second, promoting renewable energy use and supporting a fair transition. Third, increasing the supply of electric and hydrogen vehicles. And third, promoting green investments and R&D and finance with 6 trillion won. So we promote prospective business to lead the green industry and establishing low carbon and green industrial complex. Second, laying the foundation for the green innovation via R&D and finance. Korean government also take the green finance initiative to encourage the investment and participation by private sector. Financial Supervisory Service, my firm organization, held inaugural meetings of high-level bankers, insurance specialists in the June of last year to do stock-taking exercise of best practices in their activities to support green transformation and promote exchange of information and practices. And FSS also at the time embarked on the stress test of the climate change on the capital adequacy of the financial industries. And Financial Services Commission, policy body, officially adopted a green agenda as part of our financial policy in August this year. And underlying rationale was financial policy, as it has the potential to mobilize the financial resource up to as much as 10 times of government budget, should support fiscal authorities' Green New Deal to sustain and amplify this effect. And it's also in its interest of financial sectors and regulators to internalize the risk associated with the climate change. And according to British think tank Carbon Tracker, Korea's stranded asset is estimated to amounting to 105 billion US dollars, which is #1 in the world. So let me explain the 4 pillars of green finance. First, the government will define the risk borne by financial sectors associated with the climate change and prepare the plans to incorporate climate risk in our supervision framework by the end of this year. And second, we'll encourage the listed company and financial sectors to disclose the environment-related information. Specifically, we provide the guidance for the best practices and information disclosure and prepare a training program for environmentally responsible investments. Third, we will increase green investment and improve incentive structures in favor of green investments. We plan to finalize green taxonomy and guidelines for green finance by the end of this year. And policy banks will increase their resources in the form of green bonds, loans, private equity funds, and guarantees to support green industries. Pension funds and institutional investors will evaluate contribution of their investment on climate. And fourth, finally, to build up infrastructure of sustaining green finance. And regulators and central bank will join NGFS, TCFD, international networks and bodies, and beef up their organization and manpower. The government also create committee and unit serving and following up for the green finance. That was the plan recently released by the Financial Services Commission. Let me conclude with the implication and assessment. Let's look at the fiscal side. In my view, it was timely and effective policy mix, countering adverse long-lasting shocks caused by COVID-19, adapting to anticipated structural change, including climate change-related green transformation, requires extraordinary fiscal policies and spendings. Of course, the impact of the medium-term spending commitment on fiscal balance is not clear. It's part of the total government envelope, or it's additional to existing traditional fiscal envelope. It's not clear, but we have to be coupled with the post-COVID fiscal discipline, as Professor Yoshino mentioned, there are some, even in the context of Korea, we have a government budget, government debts as 43% of the government GDP, Korea's GDP, so which is very low among OECD countries, with one of the lowest government debt countries. But however, there are some discussions whether our fiscal deficit and fiscal burden is sufficient enough to withhold the shocks and address this kind of challenges. So there are some discussion whether need the exit strategy in post-COVID-19 era, but maybe it's too early to say about the post-COVID-19 crisis because it's still in the pipeline. Of course, in the context of Korea, rapid aging and rise in social spending undermines fiscal soundness. Unlike Japan, Korean currency is not really internationally tradable, so we are very susceptible to suffering credit rating. So if there are signs that undermining fiscal soundness, in part, for example, due to rapid aging or rise in big spending, then there's a risk Korea suffer from a downgrade of our social credit rating, which will have a huge impact on issuing government bonds overseas or domestically. But I think on general consensus will be that Korea still have a buffer, fiscal buffer to sustain those shocks and maybe able to mobilize more resources on the structural transformation of the economy, including Green New Deal. Let's look at the environmental aspect, and of course, we gain momentum. We have to need to follow up. Present administration, especially President Moon's yesterday's remarks and commitments to carbon zero target by 2050 was enormous, and in the wake of crisis, and it naturally opens a window of opportunity for the green environments and green growth. So succeeding the previous opposition ruling party's green growth strategy was very well applauded, and the government officially adopting green economy agenda as part of national strategy in the wake of those COVID-19 driven crisis, and parliamentary move gets much more stronger. So we expect that we like to gain more momentum, further momentum in an international context if the, as I mentioned, that many countries now joining to international commitments to reduce our carbon emission by 2050. And in the case of Korea, we're also thinking about establishing Green Finance Corporation, mainly driven by the Congress, and more pension funds and Korean Investment Corporation, KB financial groups announcing zero carbon exposure. So even financial sectors following up, and they are now stay away from their financial exposure to those carbon intensive industries, and they are gradually shifting to green investments. However, there's no targets, but this requires modification because now we have a target for greenhouse gas emission by 2050 yesterday, but we don't have a specific target for share of renewable energy. So I think that the lack of details still is important matters to be filled in, and we need more details down the roads. And in terms of green finance, we just started policy works and required further work. We're expecting much more positive and progress down the roads. So I guess that we need to wait for the more specifics to come, but by the end of this year, we are supposed to present the 2050 long-term low carbon strategy and action plan. So I hope that all those discussions could be contained and workable as a part of workable actions by the end of this year. And also in terms of green finance, we are focusing on balancing physical and transition risk, but I think that now it's more of a transition risk, and then I expect many financial companies and governments, policy bank will follow to support the green economy and green industries. And this will be an end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yu, for the interesting presentation about the Korean government's Green New Deal. It's very interesting, and yeah. So we have a few minutes for questions before we start the next session. If there is any question from the panelists and also from the participants. I have one question before I ask other panelists from Dr. Yu. So in your presentation, in your keynote speech, I've seen that pension funds are among the institutional investors, potential institutional investors for bringing capital and investment for achieving these goals in this Green New Deal. So is there any incentives from the side of Korean government for incentivizing their investments into green projects and or other renewable energy projects? Is there any incentives?
I think that governments may, especially Ministry of Finance, may come up with some incentive on tax incentive or some subsidies to better pricing those investment on those green projects. But I think that right now, I think that when I met several chairmen of the financial holding companies, now it's in their own interest. They're now naturally moving towards green investment. They are shifting away from those carbon intensive industries because now, as I told you, BlackRock and Fidelity, they send a letter to those chairmen of those financial holding companies. And even whole worldwide investors have much more interest than before. It is surprising for the last 2 or 3 years. And recently we received some signs that when you make an investment, your portfolio, asset portfolio, they are looking at more balance or even more shift towards the green economy. And now chairmen have confessed that now it's their own interest. They have to save. They have to really make their assets safer and not susceptible to the risk driven by those climate change. And it seems, of course, we're providing. I think that the tax department may provide some incentive down the road. But I guess that still now it seems that the many financial companies feels it's very natural they move on to those investment on minimizing exposure on those carbon intensive industries and now increasing the exposure. I think this is my assessment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, because the pension funds are good potential investors as they are keeping long-term money, so they could be a good investors for green project and other infrastructure projects. So is there any question from the panelists? And also
I have one question.
Yes, Professor Qazi.
My question is, like, as the Korea is planning to go for carbon-free economy, what are the short-term and the long-term policy for energy transition from fossil fuel to more renewable energy areas?
May I? As you see in my presentation,
yes,
the governments just decide to increase the share of renewable energy to the share of renewable energy in electricity generation to 20% by 2030, which is not in line with our commitment. So I think that our colleagues in the Ministry of Energy, they have to they have to rework their schedules and they rework their model because this is not consistent. So that's why I'm saying that we have to follow up the further progress down the road, because now this is a very dramatic commitments by the president, because Korea is heavily dependent on fossil fuel, and so we are number 7 in terms of greenhouse gas emission in the world. So we have to see, and it's not still worked out yet.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If there is any question from the panelists or from the attendees, and also we are broadcasting on in Facebook as well. So if there is any question from the Facebook participants or from other panelists. Okay, so if there is no more question, we can save the time and we move to the next session. But before that, let's have a group photo as we have almost all speakers here. And if Dr. G also turns on his camera. Okay, would you please turn on your camera so that we have a Professor Qazi, would you please turn on your, okay. Okay, Dr. G, maybe he's not here. Okay, so ready, 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much. So I will share this photo later. Okay, so let's move to the next session. In this session, we will have distinguished speakers, and each presentation will be about 10 minutes so that we have time for discussions for the last session, which is on discussion. Our first speaker is Professor Hiroaki Miyamoto from Tokyo Metropolitan University. His presentation is on population aging and the effectiveness of fiscal policy. Professor Miyamoto, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hiro Miyamoto. I'm a professor in Tokyo Metropolitan University. This is great, my honor to be here and present my work. So let me share my screen. Can you see my screen now? Okay. So today I'm going to talk about the population aging and the effectiveness of fiscal policy. And this is my joint work with Professor Yoshino. He just gave us opening keynote speech at the beginning of today's conference. So in this research, we want to know how population aging affects the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus. And this topic is very important, not only for the economists, but also policymakers. The reason is simple. First, now we are in the middle of COVID-19 pandemic, and many countries are now undertaking a fiscal stimulus to support the economy. And even before the current crisis, the importance of fiscal policy has been increasing. This is because the monetary policy is constrained by near zero interest rate. And moreover, in many countries now population aging is proceeding. So that's why we focus on this topic. So now let me talk about the current situation of population aging in the world. So this chart shows the evolution of old age dependency ratio. The old age dependency ratio is a ratio of people 65 years old and older to those between 15 and 64 years old. And this ratio is often used as a measure of population aging. And as you can see from this chart, this ratio has been increasing over the time, and currently Japan has the highest old age dependency ratio. It is about 40%. According to the United Nations, it will be around 70% by 2050. So population aging will proceed very rapidly in next few decades. But this is not only for Japan. As you can see from this chart, Korea, China, US, Europe, all country and the region in this chart will face this rapid population aging. So given the situations, recently the studies on macroeconomic implication of population aging are increasing. So these studies mainly focus on the impact of population aging on the economic growth, savings, consumption, as well as fiscal burden. The reason is population aging is related to pension and Medicare and healthcare. However, little attention has been paid to the impact of population aging on the effectiveness of fiscal policy. So that's why in this research, we want to fill this gap by estimating, by empirically examining the effect of fiscal policy to boost the economy in the aging and non-aging economy. And our finding is the following. We found that the population aging weakens the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus. So now, let me explain the details. So in this paper, we estimate so-called fiscal multiplier by using panel data of OECD country for both aging economy and non-aging economy. The following recent literature, first we identify government spending shock by using forecast error approach, which was developed by Albaha Goronichenko. And once we have government spending shock, the next step is we need to estimate how government spending shock affect output or growth. And to do so, we use local projection method, which is developed by Jordans. So now, let me show our result. Now you can see 3 charts in this slide. Please look at this left chart first. This chart shows how government spending shock affects economic growth. And in this chart, we do not care about population aging. Now we ignore the degree of population aging and just estimate the fiscal multiplier. So vertical axis shows the fiscal multiplier, and the horizontal line is years after the shock. So in this analysis, we assume government spending shock takes place at time 0. And this blue line shows responses of economic growth, and the red dashed line is the confidence intervals. So as you can see from this chart, a positive government spending shock boosts the economy. That is this blue line, and this effect is statistically significant. And if you look at the number, at time 0, fiscal multiplier is around 0.7. This is consistent with recent literature of fiscal multipliers. Now, we divide our sample into 2 groups. One is aging economy, the other one is non-aging economy, and we do the same exercise. And this chart shows fiscal multiplier in aging economy, and this right chart shows fiscal multiplier in non-aging economy. As you can see from this chart, in aging economy, the fiscal impulse response function is not statistically significant. On the other hand, in the non-aging economy, the impulse responses are statistically significant. So by comparing these 2 charts, we can conclude that population aging reduces the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus, or we can say weakens the growth impact of government spending shock. So this is our baseline result. Then we estimated state-dependent fiscal multiplier. What is a state-dependent fiscal multiplier? This is a multiplier, fiscal multiplier over the business cycle. According to recent literature, we know that the fiscal multiplier differs between booms and recession. And the previous studies show that the fiscal multiplier during recessions are more likely to be higher than those during booms. So we can check whether that is the case for aging economy and non-aging economy. So here we estimate the fiscal multiplier in aging economy during booms and recession. Similarly, we compute it for non-aging economy. And what we found is the following. In both aging and non-aging economy, fiscal multiplier during recessions are higher than those during booms. And the second finding is that in fiscal multiplier during recession in non-aging economy is higher or greater than those in aging economy. So again, we conclude that the population aging weakens fiscal multiplier even we controlling business cycles. So this is our main result. And then the question is how population aging reduce the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus. And we check this, and we found that since time is limited, I just mentioned our conclusion, our findings. We found that in the aging economies, responses of private consumption and employment to government spending shock becomes weak. That's why multiplier effect will be the weaker in aging economy. This is the reason why we have a smaller fiscal multiplier in aging economy. This is our findings. So let me wrap up. So we found that population aging weakens the effectiveness of fiscal policy. So this is our findings. So what's policy implications? First, In order to support aggregate demand during recessions, in aging economy, we need larger fiscal stimulus. Otherwise, we cannot boost the economy. This is the first messages. However, in order to conduct larger fiscal stimulus, we need sufficiently large fiscal rooms. So otherwise, it creates concern for fiscal sustainability. So in order to conduct a larger fiscal stimulus during recession, we need to secure sufficiently large fiscal rooms during booms. These are key messages. And also, so in this research, we found that the effectiveness of fiscal policy in the aging economy will be smaller. And the same result apply for monetary policy. Some research and my work with Professor Yoshino found that in the aging economy, not only fiscal policy, but also monetary policy's effect will be smaller. So given that, we may need other macroeconomic policy to support aggregate demand. And we think some like a labor market reform will be very important because policy measure to enhance labor supply would help increase output effect in the aging society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Miyamoto, for your interesting presentation and finishing it within the time. So let me invite the next presenter, Professor Hyun-Suk of Korea, of Yonsei University and Asia Research Center of Yonsei University from Republic of Korea. So his presentation is on frequent issuers and asymmetric information in green bond markets. Professor Hyun-Suk, please.
Thank you, Professor Farhad. Let me share my slide. Okay, can you see my slide?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay, yeah, let me start my presentation. Yeah, first of all, I'm very happy to co-host this second webinar with the Tokai University, and I want to give a special thanks to Professor Farhad for organizing these webinars. And today I would like to share my interim result of the empirical study in green bond. I'm still doing my empirical study. This is just an interim result. So as the Vice Chancellor mentioned, in order to achieve both fiscal and environmental sustainabilities, we should utilize more private investment for sustainable development. In that sense, a green bond is one of a useful instruments to achieve that objective. So this is the outline for my presentation. So recently, the green bonds have become one of the main instruments which deal with the financing problems in sustainable development, as you know. And green bonds are undoubtedly beneficial if they can be labeled as green, which enable to raise funds for environmental friendly projects with low financing cost. Many empirical studies show that the yield of a green bond is relatively lower than that of the ordinary or conventional bonds. So the central debate of green bonds still remain how to determine whether bonds may be classified as green or not, because actually at the international level, we have the many green bond standard like GBP and CBS, but it is not mandatory. And also at the national level, each country, they have a domestic green bond standard. So objective evaluation of environmental benefits has been a key issue since the green bond market started to grow. Yeah. Here I focus on the asymmetric information in green bond market because the asymmetric information is the fundamental problems between lenders and borrowers in the financial market, but I think asymmetric information problem is more severe in green bond market because investors need more information on the use of proceeds and also the evaluation on the environmental impacts. So compared to the ordinary bonds. However, generally it is very difficult to measure the degree of information asymmetries. So we assume that the frequent issuers can provide more information to investors, and this affects the bond pricing. And that's why the green bond issuers, they send the credible signal to investors by acquiring certification or verification and the green labels. And the fundamental the issue is that the issuers, green bond issuers and investors have a different amount of information on green bonds. So we interpret it by considering the characteristics of a frequent issuers of green bonds that can reduce asymmetric information and reputational risk, and the well-established reputation of the frequent green bond issuers provide assurance to investors against the greenwashing of green bonds. And let me introduce briefly the literature reviews. So in that sense, a green bond is very similar to the lemon problems, first described by Akerlof in 1970 papers. In an incomplete market with the asymmetric information on the quality of green bonds. So investors cannot distinguish the quality of green bonds efficiently. So consequently, they tend to have the willingness to pay the market average price for their investment without regard to the intrinsic value of the green bonds. And many other papers point out the green bonds can be a form of the greenwashing and good example of information asymmetries. That's why other papers also point out more disclosure, more information disclosure can reduce this asymmetric informations. In our empirical studies, so we employ the Osaka blind decompositions to investigate quantitatively the price difference between frequent and infrequent issuers in green bonds. So first, we build an empirical model to characterize the major determinants of bond yield. And then further, we decompose the price difference between two groups. That is infrequent issuers and the frequent issuers in green bond market. And actually, the central idea about the blind Osaka decomposition is explain how much of a difference in mean outcomes across the two groups is due to group differences in the level of explanatory variable and how much is due to differences in the magnitude of a regression coefficient. For more details, please refer to these papers. I just skipped the technical explanation due to the time limit, but I briefly explained the central idea of Osaka blind decompositions. This is the A stands for the infrequent issuers and B stands for the frequent issuers. This is the bond yield difference, and we can further decompose. So this impact from the endowment differences and the second term from the coefficient, the estimated from the model, and then the third term is the interactions, the endowments and the coefficient, and then we can further decompose like the equations. So explained part. Usually we just use the bond yield determinants like bond issue amount and maturities and credit ratings. This is belongs to the fundamental bond characteristics. However, we focus on this part, the unexplained part. It can be interpreted as asymmetric informations. So the difference between come from the infrequent issuers and the frequent issuers. So yeah, this is the estimation regression result. So I collected the data from Bloomberg, and the number of infrequent issuers 215 and frequent issuers 291, and starting from 2014 to 2018. If you, I'm sorry that the small the characters, the small size of the characters. So if you look at the sign of a coefficient, the empirical result the mainly consistent with the theoretical relationship established in the bond market. And this figure shows the result of Osaka blind decomposition with infrequent issuers as the reference group. In this is the explained part. The most variable appear to have a statistically insignificant in the 95% of confidence intervals. But however, if you look at the unexplained part, it appears that a significant portion of the yield difference is driven by group difference in issue amount and credit rating, and marginally the coupon and the label of green bonds. So I selected the significant and the marginally significant variables. The unexplained part can be decomposed further in the unexplained component in infrequent issuers and the unexplained component in frequent issuers. If you look at the unexplained component, this figure shows how much issue amount and the credit rating contribute to the price discriminations in favor of infrequent issuers and against the frequent issuers. So if you look at this table, the overall mean difference in the bond yield between infrequent issuers and the frequent issuers is 170 basis points. So this difference is statistically significant over the draw bootstrap samples. The parameter estimated for the explained part and the unexplained part is 1.767, and the unexplained part is minus 0.06 respectively. If we assume that unexplained component of bond yield difference happens due to asymmetry informations and the pooled regression coefficients are non-discriminatory, the blind Osaka decomposition would then also indicate 6 basis points of unexplained part originated from asymmetric informations in favor of infrequent issuers. So this is the interim result of my empirical studies. Let me summarize and draw some implications. So without detailed information on greenness, the true value of a green bond, including the environmental impacts, the green bond authenticity is based on the invisible characteristics subject to asymmetric informations. Therefore, the more disclosures of a project environmental information and the external certification and verification can lower the degree of asymmetric information exists in green bond market, and consequently can lower the financing cost by sending credible signal to investors. So let me summarize the empirical result. Based on the empirical result, the market has required a higher yield from the infrequent green bond issuers, not only because of their basic bond characteristics regarding credit worthiness, but also because of asymmetric information in green bond market. And secondly, all other things being equal, the market has discriminated the yield against the infrequent green bond issuers. It, on average, require higher yield by 6 basis points for infrequent issuers than it would have demanded from frequent issuers with equivalent characteristics. That's all for my presentation, and thank you for your listenings.
Thank you very much, Professor Hyun-Suk, for your interesting presentation. And so the next presenter is Mr. Cedric Rimaud, who is the ASEAN manager at Climate Bond Initiative, the co-host and co-organizer of this event. So Cedric's presentation is on green bond for infrastructure financing through the value capture model. Mr. Cedric, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Farhad. Very nice to be with you all today. So let me start my presentation on green bonds for infrastructure. So the green bond market is seeing a very strong increase in amount of issuance, and it's part of a wider trend that we are seeing in the bond market with the issuance of other thematic bonds, including social bonds, sustainability bonds, and pandemic bonds, the most recent in response to COVID-19. So I will focus on green bond today, but obviously there are similar opportunities in those other thematic bonds as well, which are worth remembering. I would also add that we are seeing a very strong increase in thematic loans as well, with green loans and sustainability loans also rising. As of today, the market for green bond has already exceeded $1 trillion of amount outstanding, and that's about 1% of the global bond markets worldwide. So, and this has been achieved in only a few years. So this is a very significant growth. When we look at the types of sectors that are being financed, 87% of those green bonds finance three main sectors: the renewable energy space, green buildings, and transportation. So this is quite important to remember. There are other types of projects that potentially could be financed through green bond, including water, waste management, land use, industry, and others. But we see a very strong predominance on those three sectors. So today, my presentation will focus on the transport aspect, as it is an important part of this market. And this is where new forms of financing can be used, in particular for developing nations around Asia Pacific, where the need for resilient infrastructure is really, really acute, given the size of populations that this region harbors. So when we look at the geographical breakdown of those green bonds, it's clear that it's dominated by a few markets. China, first of all, which is one of the largest markets of green finance, but also Australia, India, and Japan, because of the development of the bond market in these countries. When we look at Southeast Asia, there is actually a great diversity of green bonds that we see, and it's quite encouraging to see, for example, a perpetual green bonds in the Philippines for AC Energy, green sukuk in Malaysia for corporate issuers, as well as for sovereign issuers in Indonesia with 2 green sukuk issuance, green loans focusing mostly on real estate in Singapore, and in Thailand and the Philippines, green bonds from corporate issuers, as well from renewable energy in particular, and transportation for, in Thailand, for example, the BTS group. So quite a diverse spectrum of categories of issuers, from non-financial corporates, financial corporates, and some sovereigns as well. This market is underpinned by solid standards from the, first of all, the green bond principles from the International Capital Markets Association, but the Climate Bonds Initiative has developed a taxonomy that breaks down into different types of industry sector. And in the transport category, for example, we have criteria that we have published already for private transportation, public passenger transportation, as well as freight rail. And there are some other sectors that will be developed in the future in other categories. So this land value capture model is a model that has already been tested in other parts of Asia, but it's important to see the opportunity that the green bonds market offers for financing infrastructure in developing Asia. For example, if we look at Indonesia, some statistics that have been conducted, calculated in 2017, to see what is the share of cost for when commuters are using transportation means. And we see that 62% of their usage of transportation is from private transportations. And public forms of transportations represent only 11% of the total, the rest being on foot or others. So we see a very strong importance allocated to private transportation. And the challenge is how to move from private transportation, i.e. cars that are contributing to carbon emissions, to public forms of transportation where we can use electric trains or electric buses and that have a positive, that don't contribute so much to the global warming. So there is an interesting analysis done by the Asian Development Bank on this model of the land value capture model, which is a way to finance climate resilience transport systems for Asia using basically the future value of infrastructure. For example, when you open a new rail link, you create new benefits for the people using these modes of transport. You get better accessibility. The areas around the train stations gain in value. There is new shopping malls that can be constructed on tops of train stations. The residential property value can increase. So there is a value uplift on the land that surrounds this infrastructure. And the question is, how can we capture this value that will accrue in the future to finance the infrastructure today? And the best instrument for that is a bond, basically, because you borrow in the public market to pay for this infrastructure, and you repay the debt from the value that has been created, either through the form of a tax or if it's a private consortium, it could be through the running of shopping malls and others. So the idea is to find ways of financing infrastructure and climate resilience infrastructure for emerging Asia that would not rely on taxpayers' money, but on this new value that this infrastructure creates. When some research has been conducted on the gains that have been made possible by the creation of new railway lines, for example, this is the case in Manila, where researchers have looked at the gains in value of commercial properties and residential properties after a new rail line has been announced. And they found that the gains after the announcement range between 12% for commercial to 25% for residentials. After the construction has started, the gains increased to 52% in the case of commercials and 25% in the case of residential. Upon completion of the railway line, further gains of 26% for commercial and 25% for residential are seen. And once the railway line is put in operation, further gains of 10% for commercial properties and 25% for residential have been achieved. So quite a significant amount of uplift in the value of adjacent properties and land values. So that's where the opportunity really lies. And this is not something that is new, because there has been such scheme already in the rest of Asia. For example, in Hong Kong, the MTR revenue shares in 2017 includes 58% of the revenues of the corporation coming from transport operations, and the rest from commercial businesses, 19%, and property rental and management businesses for 16%. So in several developed nations in Asia, this model already exists. I believe it's already exists also in Japan, in Korea, in Singapore. So the idea is to take advantage of this opportunity for building new infrastructure in the rest of emerging Asia and use green bonds as a way to finance that. So how can we support those green bonds? We have published a criteria for transport, low carbon transportation. And this criteria covers private light duty and heavy goods vehicles, public passenger transportation, dedicated freight railway lines, and all the supporting infrastructure that goes with it. So it's defining what types of transport modes are eligible for a green bond. And issuers can use this criteria as a way to justify their green bond issuance. And we've seen in the case of Thailand, the BTS group issued 13 billion baht of green bonds, which we have certified under our low carbon criteria. This green bond has received the second party opinion from Sustainalytics, and it will finance 2 new monorail lines in Bangkok. And it's aligned with the green bond notification issued by the Thai ACC, as well as the ASEAN Green Bond Principles and the Green Bond Principles. And it's received a very good interest from investors. The bond issuance was very successful. It was increased from its original amount, and it was, I think, 8 times oversubscribed, meaning that there were 8 times more investors who wanted to buy this bond than there was on offer, which is a good sign. So there are clear benefits for the issuers in terms of being able to reissue those green bonds, as well as accessing new capital. Issuers that we speak to, and we often have conversations with treasurers, they speak of a greater diversification of investors, low carbon integrity of the certification, as well as the standards attracts a much broader base of investors. For example, the BTS group said on one of our webinars that they were able to increase the amount of investors they were speaking to about 30%. And this is something that the Republic of Indonesia is also saying in terms of the investors that bought their green sukuk. Green bond issuers are also able to access lower cost of capital. We start to see the emergence of a pricing advantage, although there's still something that is being studied, but there is increasing evidence that there is a so-called greenium appearing in this market. And this is being supported by the high oversubscription for green bonds that we see when we see demand from investors very often outstripping the supply. And the types of investors that are buying those green bonds are usually what we would say good quality investors, in that they are buy and hold. They keep those green bonds in their portfolio. And given the strong demands in the primary market, they tend to keep these bonds within their investment portfolios and not trade out of it. It results in tighter yield as well. And for an issuer, it's a good enhancer of the green reputation of the issuer, as we are increasingly talking now about transitioning businesses from what we would say a brown state to a green state, and looking at how their operations can be transitioned towards a low carbon strategy. So this is becoming increasingly popular. So again, if you need any data from ourselves, Climate Bonds Initiative maintains a database of green bonds. If any of your research papers need some help from us, please reach out. We're happy to participate in that. Dr. Farhad, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Cedric, for your interesting presentation on green bond. So next is my turn, and I'm going to present. So let me share my screen. Okay. So is it clear now? Yes. Okay. So this is a joint work with Professor Yoshino, Cedric Rimaud of Climate Bond Initiative, and my former student at Yonsei University, Alain Morta. So in this research, we looked at the green bond markets in Asia, Europe, and America, and analyzed the characteristics of these bonds market, especially from the point of view of return and risk, in order to find out that whether if there is any significant differences between the returns of green bonds in these markets and also for the risk. So this is the introduction. One of the biggest barriers in the development of the renewable or green energy projects is their risk and also the maturity of this project, which is long term. Currently, we have low investments in green sector globally. In 2017 and in 2018, new investments in renewable energy projects and also in energy efficiency projects reduced by 3% and 1% respectively. In 2019, in the new investments in renewable projects increased gradually, but energy efficiency new investments reduced. And in 2020, it expected to shrink drastically because of the COVID-19 from one side, and on the other hand, because of low fossil fuel prices that reduce the competitiveness of green projects. So this shows the importance of green finance and green investments. So in Asia, the situation, Asian financial system is mainly dominating by banks, and banks are not very suitable resources for financing green projects and other infrastructural projects, because banks are holding short to medium term resources. However, these projects are mainly long term. So it will be a maturity mismatch if allocating bank resources to these projects. On the other hand, venture capital is not well developed in Asia, and we have a scarce of venture capital. So this shows the importance of innovative financing and looking for other terms of financing, especially green bonds, which are a suitable sources and suitable means for financing, as mentioned by Cedric. So in this research, we aim to answer to three questions. How do green bonds market, green bonds in Asia compare in terms of size and maturity, size and time to maturity with green bonds issued in other regions? In terms of risk and return, what is the comparison between the green bonds in Asian market comparing to other markets? How does the type of issuer affect the performance of bonds? Whether the type of issuer, is it related to the green bonds return and risk, or whether these are not related to each other? A brief review of the literature shows that this is a simple definition of green bonds: bonds that issue to fight climate change and whose proceeds go to green asset. They can be issued by central and local governments, by banks, or by corporations. The label green bond can be applied to any type of debt, such as green loans, private placements, securitization, covered bonds, and also sukuk. So about 521 billion worth of green bond have been issued since 2007, with an acceleration since 2015. Asia Pacific share of issuance in particular has grown at a rate of 35% between 2017 and 18, led by China, Japan, and Australia. So regarding the characteristics of green bonds, a review of literature shows that green bonds can be useful in fighting climate change. However, they show lower return and lower yields. They are more expensive to issue. They are riskier as they show a higher volatility than their conventional counterparts. So before running the empirical parts, here is the theoretical background of this research. So we have a agent's utility function, that the utility is depending on return and risk. So this agent is investing in two types of bonds, Asian green bonds and non-Asian green bonds. And the total return is a function of the return of each of these bonds. RNA shows the return of non-Asian and RA shows Asian return. And also risk is a function of the total risk is a function of risk of these two types of assets. And next we have the utility, which is coming from the equation that I showed in upper part by substituting these equations. Solving the agent's utility maximization problem, we apply the first order condition with respect to alpha. Alpha shows the weight that investors decide to put in non-Asian green bonds. And 1 minus alpha shows the share of Asian green bonds. Then we reach to this alpha star in the bottom of this slide that shows the optimal weight of investment in non-Asian green bonds, which is a function of return of non-Asian green bond, return of Asian green bonds, and also risk of both of these. Here, the orange point shows the initial optimal portfolio for allocation of the assets between these two types of bonds, green bonds in Asia or Asian green bonds and non-Asian green bonds. So if we have some schemes to increase the rate of return of Asian green bonds, then we will have a new optimal portfolio or new portfolio with higher weight for Asian bonds. Or for example, an incentive could be carbon taxation, collecting carbon taxation from polluting industries and injecting these into green projects in order to increase the rate of return. That will give us a new alpha star, which is alpha star new. And as it's clear here, by bringing this spillover from the carbon taxation, we can increase the rate of returns of the Asian green bonds. That will reduce the alpha star, because alpha star was share of investment into non-Asian green bonds. So it means it will be more investment into Asian green bonds market. Okay, next is the empirical part. In the empirical part, we have collected data from Bloomberg. Return of bonds is from Bloomberg's. We have coupon rates. We have issuing firms. We have a dummy variable that shows that issuing firms, public issuers, banking and finance, power and utility, manufacturing and other, and time to maturity. And the size and time to maturity is from CBI. Next, we ran this panel data using the, 366 sample size of Asian, 603 Europe, and 205 North America, respectively. We have the dependent variable is return, and the explanatory variable, as it's clear, we have vector of control variables, which is issued amount, coupon rate, and time to maturity. And we have this sector, which represent the vector of dummy variable associated with the issuing company. This is the interest variable. This is a variable that we are looking for, and the year that represent the dummy variable. we have U and epsilon, which are idiosyncratic and composite error terms. This pie chart shows the issuers by type. As it is clear, Asian green bonds market is dominating by banking and finance. It means financial institutions and banking institutions are the main issuers of green bonds in Asia, comparing to North America and Europe. That, as we see in Europe, it is more diversified, and in North America it is also more diversified when comparing to Asia. Next, we have done a mean variance analysis in order to compare the return and risk of green bonds in Asia with North America and Europe. As it is clear, Asian green bonds have higher return but higher risk when comparing to Europe and North America. And then we looked at different sectors. In banking sector, the red dot shows Asia. The Asian banking sector, as it is clear, I mean, those bonds, green bonds that issued by banking sectors have higher return and higher risk comparing to those green bonds that issued by banking sector in North America and Europe. In almost in all of these regions, except the manufacturing sector, return of Asian green bonds and risk is higher. And when we are looking at when we do a comparison in different sectors, we see that the power and utility has the higher return, but also higher risk when comparing to banking sector and other sectors. Next, we ran this regression, 3 regressions for Asia and also for Europe and North America. As we see here, the coupon rate is significant, it is clear, and the dummy variable of the banking sector is also significant and negative. So it means the low returns of the green bonds that issued by Asian banking sectors is negatively affecting the total returns of the Asian green bonds. So it means the sectoral dummy is matter and the type of issuer is matter, and it's affecting the total return. The time variable that we have in 2020, the coefficient is negative. So this is mainly because of COVID-19 that negatively affected many green projects and also the returns of green bonds in Asia. In Europe, as we see, the coefficient of banking sector is not significant, but for the power and utility, it is significant, and it is negatively affecting. And in North America, we don't see this sectoral significance on the total return. So because it is more diversified, so one sector cannot affect that much on the total return. So let me interpret the results and finally provide some policy recommendations from our research. The vast majority of Asian green bonds are issued by companies from the banking and finance. Asian bonds are more long-term oriented and have a higher return on average, but are shown to be riskier for investors. The type of issuer is shown to have a statistically significant impact on the rate of return. Bonds issued by banking sector in Asia show lower return, which could reflect the relative risk averseness of the sector. This particular effect was not found in other regions. And also we found out that in 2020, due to COVID-19, the rate of return affected. So what we found that Asian green bond market is very interesting from the return perspective, but it is riskier. So it is important to implement de-risking policies by the governments in Asia in order to reduce the risk of green investments and risk of green bonds in order to bring the more inflow of capital, and also utilizing schemes such as carbon taxation spillover in order to increase the return of these projects. Another policy recommendation is to diversify the issuers. Presently, the issuance is dominating by the banking and finance. So it's important to diversify, having more public sectors, utilities, and other non-banking sectors as issuers. And another way to make Asian bond more attractive is to enhance financial cooperation between Asian and European investors, as recommended by our previous work. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay, so now we have, let's have a few minutes break, because according to our agenda, we have 10 minutes break, but let's make it 5 minutes and then we come back in 5 minutes. So no need to leave this room, both panelists and attendees, but we will resume our presentations in 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah, so can I share my slide in advance? Oh,
yes, please, please.
Okay.
Okay, so let's start our next session. So in this part, we are going to have 3 presentations. The first presentation of this subsection is by Professor Kazuki Hiraga of Faculty of Political Science and Economics, Tokai University. His presentation is on fragility in the modeling consumption tax revenue implication for post-COVID-19. Hiraga-san, please.
Thank you for the introducing our presentation. I'm Kazuki Hiraga, Associate Professor of Tokai University. And so our research is titled by the fragility in modeling consumption tax revenue in macroeconomic as a neoclassical growth model. And so this title is the main title in our paper. And but so the Farhad-san gave me a homework as the additional policy implication and the normative implication for after COVID-19 in the titles in this workshop. And then I prepared some of the my best answer in the later section. Okay. Anyway, let's go to the main presentation. So our paper is the theme is simple and easy to understand. So we are interested in the consumption tax and its revenue itself. And so consumption tax has been receiving attention both political and academic issues, not only the Japan but also the other countries. And this is because there is a big debate in increasing consumption tax rate in Japan and the other countries. Actually, some European countries such as UK, Denmark, Norway, so on, the countries set standard VAT consumption tax rate is larger than 20%. And then but there are some research using some model with consumption tax in neoclassical representative or heterogeneous agent model on fiscal reform, on the fiscal sustainability, such as the maximum level of the fiscal limit, and the consumption tax is to finance the government expenditure such as the social security, so on. And then our paper is focus on the shape of the Laffer curve. That is in these applied works in using the model with the consumption tax, the property of the consumption revenue curve for consumption tax is important, and we are focused on that. And so as you can see, so you can imagine the left figure in this slide, the relationship between the tax rate and the tax revenue. It is called Laffer curve. It is inverted and hump-shaped Laffer curve. But some research about the neoclassical growth model is reported that a moderately increasing function with respect to consumption tax revenue and consumption tax rate shown in the right hand side of the in the figure in this slide, such as the similar paper in Trabant Urison. And then we show that shape the Laffer curve for consumption tax and its boundness are sensitive to the functional form in the utility and use of tax revenue using neoclassical general equilibrium model analytically compared to some of the related research about some of the representative agent neoclassical growth model numerically. And so we focus on the utility function the set is so the constant labor supply elasticity. So there are three types of the well-used the utility function. The algebraically separable, king process level, some of the non-separable ones, which used in so the seminal literature in the Strabag-Ulrich, and in the Green-Helgovitz-Huffman utilities. So these utility functions are popular in macro literature. In addition, we focus on the use of the tax revenue as a transfer or the government consumption. It's down to the C and some of the wasteful. So the connected to the utility, but the independent the household decisions. And so the wrap up, so in advance, our main finding is shown as this table. Is that the consumption tax revenue is hump shape or not, is additively separable utility, yes or no, yes and no. The king process level utility is definitely no. The Green-Helgovitz-Huffman utility is yes or no. And the hump shaped, yes, so the case in the used as the government consumption case is the same, but yes, so GHH utility is definitely yes. But yes, so this paper is focused on the shape of the utility function and its use. The important for the considering about the consumption and the total tax revenue curve with respect to consumption tax rate. Okay, so we explained the related literature about the total consumption tax the tax revenue curve or the Laffer curve in the income tax case and consumption tax case. As for the income tax case, definitely we can obtain the inverted U-shape, hump-shaped Laffer curve. But some literature reported that consumption tax revenue curve is must be motorically increasing. Then our paper is the first that shows tax revenue curve for consumption tax can be hump-shaped. Okay, so that we skip here, so that some of the related the literature about fiscal reform, which is relevant to some of the policy implications in these literatures. And then, so compared to these literature, our paper has implication on the role of the consumption tax in the literature of fiscal reform, and we will discuss about later that form. And then, so I introduced briefly simple static model the simple static model is so simple that undergraduate students can solve the model. Production functions are linear with respect to the labor supply. Resource constraint is so simple as a closed model, and the government budget constraint is the levy on the consumption tax revenue, only consumption tax revenue to finance the lump sum transfer or government consumption. And then we use the three types of the well-used utility function, king process level, additively separable, and the Green-Helgovitz-Huffman. These literature is the same meaning of these seminal parameter. The one is the relative risk aversion. The other is the inverse of the labor supply elasticity. These parameters are important for our interpretations of our research. And so there are two schemes. The case is the baseline scheme is the lump sum transfer. Second scheme is the government consumption one. Then we skip the analytical solutions. So we obtain the condition about the hump-shaped Laffer curve that's shown. Then so we obtain the case in the government consumption. The consumption tax revenue is hump-shaped if and only if eta is the relative risk aversion is less than 1, for example. And then we obtain the result shown in this table. The Laffer curve is hump-shaped or not. Yes, the king process level type, yes, definitely no. algebraic separable one is so that yes, or if on and only if is so that eta plus lambda is less than 1. As the case in the so GHH one is yes, if and only if is so lambda is less than 1. The case in the so garment transfer, garment consumption, KPR is no, algebraic separable is so yes, if and only if eta is less than 1. On the other hand, yes, so GHH is definitely yes. The result is so different in the case, on that last one. Okay, so key parameter is the relative risk aversion and the inverse of the labor supply elasticity lambda. Two parameter is important. Okay, and so wrap up so that some of the we apply some extensions such as the dynamic model at Trabant Ulrich seminar literature at a steady state, but our result is basically robust in these cases. Okay, yeah, so we added some of the discussion about the parameter value in so the computing so calibration in the so such as so on is the calibrated parameter. But yes, so the peak tax rate is so the 102.8 in compared to the benchmark case is so short room of the so the tax revenue, total tax revenue in the case in the GHH utility. And then yes, so that I briefly explained the policy implication for the after COVID-19. We discussed about the long-run debate with respect to fiscal issue as after COVID-19. In the during COVID-19, is so that we needed to so that escape from the pandemic case. But yes, so after COVID-19, fiscal sustainability is the main issue in this case. And then so how much the fiscal limit is, and so we can calculate in the so using the so some of the neoclassical growth model. But which utility function is the most suitable? Actually, as so the academician, I don't know, or yes, as you like it. But the utility function is also assumption, and then so that you can change the result in the about so the total tax revenue. For example, for implication for GHS preference is so fiscal space, the fiscal limit is so some of the relatively small. And then so the Japanese government is the government needs to decrease government spending or transfer to sustain the fiscal condition. So, okay, yeah, so sorry to the later to the so over is time over. So,
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hiraga-san, for your interesting presentation on consumption tax and also the policy implication for post-COVID-19. So this interesting research, I mean, the paper of it is also available. Professor Hiraga, he shared his working paper, as you see.
Thank you for the advertisement of my paper.
For the panelists and also for the presenter. Thank you very much. So our next distinguished presenter is Professor Qazi Salahuddin from Linköping University in Sweden. His presentation is on fiscal policy response during COVID-19 and beyond. Please.
Thank you very much, Farhad, for giving me the opportunity to join this session as well as to discuss about the fiscal policy response during the COVID-19 and beyond. So the presentation today we prepared for with Ahmed Tanim Muzaffar and Rachatar, with two of my research partners. So we are basically preparing this response based on the existing literature and adding some stylized fact. And we not to presenting in a paper, just we are exploring some potential idea based on this concept. So our discussion is fundamentally based on just we'd like to share about the overview of the COVID-19 impact on the global economic growth, and what are the short-term fiscal policy implemented or suggested by the international organizations, and what would be the long-run policy cases for COVID-19, as well as in the public investment in the social sector and other development agenda. And finally, we'll just discuss about some of the policy related issues based on our understanding. So all of we are aware that this pandemic represents a public health challenge, as well as it has a serious economic as well as social consequences. And among this situation, it is the crisis is not only affected by in a particular country or particular region or in a particular group such as like developed or developing or least developing country. It is the crisis will affected to the developed, to the developing and least developing country. However, the challenges for the fiscal responses among the developed and developing countries may not be the same, because due to the shortage of the capital and shortage of the adequate amount of medical resources, developing countries are facing the more short-term fiscal challenges than compared to the developed countries. So we are interested to look about these challenges in the context of emerging and developing countries, how they can manage their debt crisis and to recovery the economy and to implement their long-term sustainability. So in the long run policy that we try to highlight it to ensure the increase the standard of living, reduction the poverty and inequality, and development of human capital and innovation. If you look at this graph during the pandemic impact, if you look at the world advanced economics, emerging market and developing economics, excluding China and also China, and this curve will give us an indication the crisis hit the real economy very hard, especially for emerging and advanced economies. However, based on this stylized fact of this data, China is expected to recover quicker than to the other region. If we then we plotted to the look at the sensitiveness or the financial market reaction between COVID-19 to the global financial crisis. And based on the CBOE VIX index, VIX is representing to the S&P 500 implied volatility stock indices. And if you look at the magnitude between 7 and 8, the global financial crisis to current period of time, COVID-19 20 crisis, you can observe it, the COVID-19, the financial market are become more strongly response to the global financial crisis. However, in terms of the financial stress index made by the Federal Reserve Bank St. Louis based on the macroeconomic, financial and other related factor, in terms of the financial stress index, it is actually compared to the global financial crisis, it is not much high. So it means the financial crisis hit to the consumers or investor sentiment more strongly than to the COVID-19. So this is probably one of the like a positive side of the COVID-19, that investors are not to be not much financial stress as compared to the global financial crisis period of time 2008 and 9. If you look at these are the short-term policy response, what I based on the ILO report, what we can observe it, the countries has responded to the fiscal measure, particularly in the area of social protection, including unemployment and job creation. Based on the global pictures, number of countries that ILO recently did their study, where they can observe it, the social allowance and grant, which is led by 16.3%. And then it is followed by job protection, several functions, health are representing by 13.4, 12.2 and 11 point. Health is representing 11.2%. Unemployment is representing the 10.4, basic services 9.1, food and nutrition 8.7, children and family 7.6, pension 6, and sickness 3.8%. So these are the some sort of short-term policy they implemented in the context of fiscal response. So if you look at this magnitude in compared to the short-term fiscal responses to the COVID-19 and additional red bar representing the additional spending, and also the blue is the loan and equity, and it's clearly observed there is a significant spending effort have taken place mostly in the advanced economies and low spending in low income countries due to insufficient fiscal capacities. So that's the point that I initially mentioned it. So if we try to implement it, some of the global model to fit it for both developed and developing countries, in the context of COVID-19 response, it will be very critical. So we need to think about how should we build a proper policy instruments or policy related or fiscal measure in the context of least developing country, because these are the graph give us the signal of the emerging or low income countries public spending on due to the COVID response. So and also it is a very important issue need to think that that how should we adjust these issues as a policy measure, because this COVID-19 is an issue, is not only the problem for developed world, it is the problem for global context. So we need to be measured in a proper global policy mechanism and adjustment with low income countries to the high income countries. So in terms of the fiscal policy in the long run, emerging countries need to be redirect the fast pace unsustainable economic model to a long run economic sustainability that is more inclusive and actually increase the quality of life for the majority of the population. And the objective of long-term fiscal policy is to increase the quality of life, human capital, and innovation. And third, the long-term fiscal policy should ensure the sustainable public consumption, investment, and create an enabling environment for innovation, raise formal work in the economy. And if you look at this response to the first recovery based on the IMF study and second outbreak in 2021, if you can look at this response, you can observe it, the developed countries and the emerging countries response is not the same. So it is so you can observe it, the emerging countries market economics are more strongly response to the developed countries. So if you look at the real GDP, the shock in the real oil price, and also the advanced economics real GDP, emerging market real GDP, you can clearly observe, as well as the government spending to GDP to compare to the advanced economics to the emerging economics, as well as the government debt to GDP as a percentage point compared to the advanced economics and as well as in the emerging. So you can observe it, the response is not the same. So this response gives the signal based on the IMF simulation model that the response would be the most strongly response to the developed emerging economics rather than to the advanced economics. So we need to put it extra special initiatives or special care or proper more policy related instruments for the emerging economics. If you look at the compare it, I just fiscal balances. In terms of the fiscal balances, this is the comparison between the Great Recession in 2008 and 10 following to the global financial crisis, and also compared to the current COVID-19 based on the information. And if you look at this one, the government debt is increased 10.5 to the 18.7. And also the global financial crisis, it was is minus 4.9. Now it is to the minus 10 in the overall fiscal balance. So we already get the feelings of the nerve of the sensitivity of the COVID-19. So which is become more stronger impact in terms of the macroeconomic and financial fundamentals. If you look at the public consumption expenditure for the three different group of countries, such as like middle income, low income, and higher income, you can observe it, the public spending in middle income countries is catching up with the high income countries. However, the outcome of the public spending still lacking behind the high income countries. The level of Human Development Index in the middle income country is still much lower than in the high income country, and the point can be seen in the next to the Human Development Index. If you look at the Human Development Index, which is led by the Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, Sweden, Singapore, South Korea, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, based on the UNDP report in 2018. And you can observe in the emerging market, the public spending to be spent more effectively, efficiently in order to improve their education and health, and also to build their robust social protection system among the developing countries. But however, it is crucial to make a public education, health, and social protection to be affordable and available to all the peoples. And also there is an increase in upward mobility due to the heavy urbanization or industrialization in the megacity, and also that could be lead to the reduce the financial burden of many households or raise the overall well-being. But this sort of urbanization also sometimes crucial for the climate related issues.
Sorry to interrupt, 2 minutes left.
Okay. So the overall, our advice or overall our understanding is during this COVID period of time, the public investment, particularly in the infrastructure related investment, could lead to the long-term economic performance of the developing country by improving the productivity growth as well as improving the standard of living. And better infrastructure improve the accessibility of public transport for general public as well as the poor household rely on the public transport. And this increase the mobility and logistical efficiency and the standard of living. So I would like to highlight a couple of style aspects like poor access to the information and communication technology in developing countries is evident. So they can improve the technological advancement. Second, they can increase the research and development expenditure for generating more innovative entrepreneurial skills. And also the government need to make sure that public debt and primary surplus are in the line with the public finance of sustainability. And government need to come up with a credible plan of how to maintain the sustainable level of public debt. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ghazi, for your interesting presentation. And it was very informative. So next presentation and the last one in this session is by Mr. Jerome Pirouz of TCX Fund of Netherlands and Javier Oseguda of Astris Finance. So I think Jerome is going to present this presentation. So
actually, hi Farhad, this is Jonas from TCX.
Okay, so Jonas, yeah.
I will do it for him.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have Jonas from TCX Fund who is going to present this work. Please.
Yes.
And Jonas, maybe I'll add a few comments when you end your presentation. Thank you.
Sure. You see, I got some help right away. Let me just open the presentation if I find it. Okay. So I will be. I hope it's full screen. Sorry, I'll be very quick if I find it. I think it'll fine like that. Yeah, should be fine.
Yes.
So I might be the only one in the section that does not have a full research to present. So we're gonna quickly present like TCX and how is it possible to advance the green bond market by providing support for cross-border flows. First of all, it's important that to present you what is TCX because we're a company that is a tool that enable a lot of investors in the international community to invest in several of the developing countries. As you may see here, TCX is a fund, first of all, that has been created 10 years ago, and that has like a number of shareholders that you can see listed here. You can see like the development finance institution, including IFC, the World Bank Group, the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And there are a number of public and private institutions. We are backed by five governments, sorry, no, four. The Dutch one, the German one, the Swiss one, and the British one. And essentially, like what the TCX provide to all these investors is hedging solution. As you, I'm sure you know in most of your research that for those who among you focus on countries and investments, you might know that in several countries, FX risk is one of the main problem when investing locally. Investing in the right currency is an issue in the sense that it's difficult to do because like all of the major investor in European country, in the US or in Japan, they have like a yen, dollar or euro, while like most of this country, they need like local currency. This can be for direct investment in a specific sector, or it can be also like when one investor want to buy like local securities that are denominated in local currency, or they should be denominated in local currency. So what do? We offer like a hedging instrument. We offer like what is a swap or a forward to cover the risk. How the mechanism work, that's very, I hope, very simple. As you might see, like imagine that as you're an investor, a lender, and you have a borrower. There can be a country, there can be a factory, it can be a bank, it can be an energy project. You can be buying a green bond. You can be buying anything like that you wish, essentially. But let's imagine that you have this, you need to make the investment in local currency because the local borrower needs local currency for his operations. So essentially what you have is that you need to provide, you have, as an investor, you have either dollar or yen or euro, but you want your borrower to do not have any FX risk. This means that this means essentially that to do that, you need to denominate your loan or your investment in the local currency. By doing so, you create what is called a synthetic local currency loan, where the local currency, the interest and the repayments are denominated in local currency. At the same time, what you do is that you swap this risk, because right now you have after doing this operation, you have a synthetic local currency loan. You swap this risk with TCX by essentially purchasing a hedge contract that swap the local currency loan, the local currency interest repayments for US dollar interest repayment. This way the risk is shifted from the borrower to the lender and then to TCX. This is a mechanism to avoid that FX risk is bear by the borrower or the lender, and instead is shifted to TCX, that is the vehicle or the fund that is better positioned to manage this risk. The beauty of this system is that we do not exchange essentially local currency. We will not move rupees. We will not move, I don't know, any currency, any local currency in the world, but we will simply denominate dollar amounts or yen amounts in the local currency to create artificially a local currency product. And then like we would settle, what is settling for difference between the two legs, local currency and the hard currency legs, to essentially compensate if there is a gain or a loss between the lender and TCX. So this is like the mechanism we offer to all of investors that wants to invest in local currency in developing markets, in currency where banks are not able to offer this product, are not able to make a market essentially for investors. And obviously, the more challenging the market, the more is likely that we are active. So how it does impact, for example, let's say a local currency PPA. This is like the case where our product might be useful and might be of your interest if you look at the renewable energy sector. So imagine that this is a simple capital structure of a project, a local currency PPA. You see on the asset side that you have a receivable up to 20 years that are denominated in local currency. So the project will receive like local currency inflows for years to come, and needs to have liabilities essentially has liability that match the assets. So you can see that on the liability side, there are like the equity part that normally is initially in US dollar, then converted in local currency. So the offshore investor is exposed to FX risk. And then you have like a medium-term local currency debt that is given by local banks. So there is no problem here, is local currency, there is no risk. And then there is the long-term US dollar debt or US dollar green bond from offshore investors. This is up to 10 years. And this is where the problem lies. This having like this US dollar liability create a mismatch and create a risk for the project. And here where TCX normally steps in by providing like the offshore investor like hedges to cover the FX risk and essentially translate this, convert this local current long-term US dollar debt in a long-term synthetic local currency debt. In this case, we write that we can do it like this kind of solution up to 55 years. This is essentially to say that we can match the duration, the long-term nature of the loan of the green bond without any problem. And we can offer like a solution to hedge the FX risk between for these investments. And I think this is it. I don't know, Jerome, if you have something to say on top of this.
Thank you very much, Jonas.
Yeah, maybe Farhad, just to give you an idea of how it works in practice. So we are currently working with the AIIB, who set up its operations 4 years ago, so they can join our development finance community. And like most of the other DFIs, they can procure long-term financing in local currency. And naturally, if they can hedge with TCX, they see no issue to on lend funding for tenors up to 15, 20, or even 25 years.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerome, for the comment, and thanks, Jonas, for your presentation, for introducing TCX and the role of TCX in hedging and reducing the risk of investment in green projects. So next, we are going to have a panel discussion, and we will have two distinguished panelists, Professor Yoshino. And Professor Yoshino, he, as I introduced him earlier, so he's Professor Emeritus of Keio University, Japan, and he's Director of Financial Research Center of FSA Institute of Government, Japan. Professor Yoshino, he is member or chairperson of several government committees in Japan. And we have Mr. Kwang-Jul Ji. He's Director of International Organization Division of the Ministry of Economy and Finance of the Republic of Korea. So in this panel, we are going to hear the panelists' opinion on the topic, which is fiscal sustainability and environmental sustainability. And also I have a question in order to start. And then if other panelists and participants, they have questions, so I will raise those questions. So Professor Yoshino, you are the chairpersons of the Japanese government bonds investors meeting. So as you have mentioned, one of the differences, the main difference between the Japanese government bond market and Greek bond or Greece government bond market is in the demand side, that for the case of Japan, majority of the investors are Japanese or institutions inside of Japan. But after the negative interest rate policy by the Bank of Japan, so it also affected the interest rate of Japanese government bond, and the yield curve shifted to down. So this policy is changing the investors in the Japanese government bonds market and brought the foreign investors. Foreign investors mainly have short-term view in the Japanese government bond market, and they are more interested in treasury bills rather than a long-term investment. So what is your suggestion, what is the optimal policy in order to keep the domestic demand in Japan in this time, and especially in the post-COVID-19? So this is a question to Professor Yoshino, and the question to Dr. G. We would be happy, and our panelists and other participants would be happy to hear about the Korean government policy in different stages of COVID-19, in the emergency stage, in the exit stage, and in the new normal life. So what are the fiscal policies in order to stimulate the growth, and what are the policies in order to keep the fiscal status of the Korean government budget sustainable? So Professor Yoshino, would you please start?
Okay, thank you very much for your comment. I'd like to talk about Japanese bond market. In my presentation, as I mentioned, majority of investors came from domestic market before negative interest rate was introduced. Even after negative interest rate was introduced, negative interest rate applies short-term until 10-year government bond. So longer-term government bonds are positive interest rate. So those long-term government bonds are not affected by negative interest rate policy. But short-term interest rate and medium-term until 10 years are affected very much. Nobody would like to buy negative interest rate bonds except for the Central Bank of Japan. So Central Bank is the major demander in those regions. However, very short-term government bonds are attracted by foreign investors because they can change from US dollar into Japanese yen, and fluctuations of the exchange rate may surpass negative interest rate. So in the short-term government bond market, 75% of investors are coming from overseas. Short-term government bonds less than 1 year, 3 months, 1 month. So those are dominated by foreign investors. So I'm very much concerned if negative interest rate policy will continue, then that will have a big impact into Japanese government bond market. And as Mr. Miyamoto presented, effectiveness of monetary policy diminishes as aging society will keep on going. So that is affecting to Japanese monetary policy. So my proposal for the Central Bank of Japan is they should not keep on using negative interest rate policy. So they should bring it back to normal monetary policy. Ineffectiveness of monetary policy is not coming from monetary policy itself. It is coming from aging population. If the population is aging, many people had retired. Transmission of monetary policy is lowering interest rate and lots of money supply. Then companies start investing into the market, activities will go on, sales will go up. So those positive impact to the companies will affect the working population. So retired people are outside of the influence of monetary policy. And in Japan, more than 1/3 of the people had been retired. So they are not affected by monetary policy. That is why effectiveness of monetary policy has diminished. But the central bank would like to use monetary policy to recover Japanese economy, but they have to realize because of aging population, effectiveness of monetary policy has been declined. So negative monetary policy should not be continued so long and bring it back to normal monetary policy. That is my own policy recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yoshino. Okay, so Dr. G, it would be a pleasure to hear your point of view.
Oh, thank you, Professor Farhad Taghizadeh. Sorry,
Yes.
pronunciation. Thank you for your question and comment about the fiscal policy in Korea. Now we are facing a COVID-19 pandemic all around globally. So as you may know, the Korean government introduced the Korean New Deal in July this year. So I will explain the details of a little bit about that regarding the fiscal policy. Based on the expectation that the world will be completely a different place after COVID-19, the Korean government is recognizing the need to anticipate and prepare for the changes that will be seen in the economic and social structures. The increase in untact activities. Untact is a new word, and non-contact activities. Since the pandemic has accelerated the shift towards a digital economy, while a stronger consensus on the urgency for climate action has led to growing demand for the green transitions, including the adoption of low carbon and eco-friendly policies. The Korean New Deal was introduced in July in this context to drive the recovery from the current crisis and to set the national development strategy for Korea to be prepared for the post-COVID-19 era. In terms of investment plans, $160 billion will be invested over the 5-year period until 2025. This includes $114 billion from the Treasury national budget, which means an average of $22 billion will be required each year, as well as $25 billion from local finances, local government's finances, and plus $20 billion from the private sector. We assume that the average annual amount from the Treasury is 8.5% of the government discretionary spending, which was about $260 billion in this year. So therefore, it is within the acceptable range of annual available fiscal capacity. As for government debt, it reached about 43% of GDP after the introduction of the third supplementary budget this year. In absolute terms, this is substantially lower than the OECD average of 110% to GDP. And therefore, we believe we have enough fiscal capacity to finance our policies. With the Korean New Deal, our goal is to achieve a rapid recovery from the economic crisis while also creating new momentum for growth. This should ultimately establish a virtuous circle that builds a strong base for tax revenues in the future. According to Korea's 2030 greenhouse gas emissions reduction roadmap, Korea needs to reduce 61.3 million tons of greenhouse gases by 2025. The Green New Deal is expected to contribute to a reduction of 12.3 million tons of greenhouse gases, which is equivalent to 20.1% of the 2025 target. At the same time, emissions from industries, buildings, and transportation make up over 90% of Korea's emissions. Since the Korean Green New Deal targets these fields, we expect relevant projects included in it to effectively reduce greenhouse gases going forward. Ultimately, we want to create a foundation for sustainable growth by accelerating the transition towards a low carbon economy and by pursuing a net zero society. At the same time, the Korean government also recognizes the importance of the vision for carbon neutrality by 2050. And we plan to continue a social discussion as we prepare the 2050 long-term low emission development strategy, which is LEDS, the initials. Korea has a high level of fiscal soundness. However, our national debt has increased rapidly following 4 rounds of supplementary budgets in response to COVID-19 this year. Our government announced fiscal rules due to the urgent need to secure fiscal space for handling the current crisis and in preparation for the future fiscal requirements such as population aging and the possibility of reunification between North Korea and South Korea. We have the dual goal of securing fiscal accountability and soundness through fiscal rules that befit our circumstances. During times of economic crisis, we will pursue expansionary fiscal policies to achieve fiscal accountability. We should strive to enhance fiscal soundness at other times as well. It is important for us to pursue spending efficiency, expand the revenue base, and manage the total amount of national debt. The Korean government will work to achieve fiscal efficiency and increase the level of fiscal soundness going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. G, for explaining about the Korean government's policy, especially in line with the Green New Deal and in the post-COVID-19. It was very interesting. So is there any question from the panelists or from the participants? Is there any question? So there is one question from Dr. Fo Min Han from the Area Economic Research Institute for ASEAN. He asked Professor Yoshino, and he mentioned that very interesting presentation by Professor Yoshino. Does China and Korea also follow the same situation of Japan where the DOMAR condition will not be relevant?
Yes, Chinese government asked me about the application of my new explanation about stability of the budget. And Chinese government is very much concerned about local government stability of government bond market. And it also applies to not only central government, but also local government, because supply and demand determines the bond market. So it applies not only Japan, Greece, but also China and Korea and many other Asian countries. Because US is key currency, dollar is key currency. And US government bonds are attracted whenever crisis hit. But other countries, when crisis hit their own country, then foreign investors will flee away from their own country. So demand goes down. That will create crisis. But US case, it is a key currency, and everybody wants to hold US government bonds or US treasury bills. So that is why DOMA condition applies. But all other countries, we have to think about supply and demand of government bonds. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for answering to the question of Dr. Fomin Han. So if there is any other question.
I have one question, Farhad.
Yes, please.
The question related to probably most Cedric. So I'm interested to know, like, how's the current condition or current investment pattern of the green loans as well as in the green equity market in Asia. Do you have any input in this context?
I'm sorry, I didn't, there was a breakage on the line.
Okay, I'm looking for the, like, what is the pattern of the Asian green loan and the green equity market?
We don't see much of equity, green equity. It's mostly green loans that we see. Okay. Green bonds are only starting. There is a lot of green bonds going through, yes, in particular for the real estate sector. That's what we see in Singapore, for example. But your point is actually relevant because we see more and more companies changing the way they communicate around their transition to more sustainability strategies. So we haven't seen a lot of studies done on how this affects the equity price. But there was one study that said that when a company announces a green bond, it has a positive impact on its share price. But that's, I don't know if you've seen that study. It's an interesting one. But we haven't seen a lot of research on that yet. I think it's probably a little bit early days on that.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask one question to Cedric?
Please, please.
Yes. When you look at a green loan or a green bond, what are the difference between ordinary bond and green bond? Are their interest rates lower than ordinary bond, or in bank loans, are they making lower interest loans? And I would like to know the difference between green related loan, bond, and other ordinary bond and loans.
Okay, so when you say is the yield lower, we have to see what is the frame of reference. If the question is an issuer able to borrow at cheaper rates than their competitors because they do green loans, it's hard to say because obviously each company has their own credit rating, their own credit standing. Yeah. So it's pretty hard to make a comparison. What we are trying to assess is whether a particular issuer, when they come to market with a green loan or a green bond, they achieve a lower cost of capital than their other bonds. And that's where there is discussions right now on whether there is a sustainable greenium, that's what we call it, a greenium, which is basically a premium for being green. And there are some issuers that display such greenium. I can send you, if you want, our latest analysis of the first half of this year in terms of pricing. And there are some analysis of that. And the other thing is, I mean, again, it's talking to treasurers and not so much a formal academic study that has been conducted. There's not enough data to be able to conduct that study. But what we hear from treasurers is that they tend to see their cost of borrowing slightly come down as they issue more and more securities, because they have access to more investors. But again, there's no hard evidence yet that this is always the case.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting points. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question or comment? Okay, so if there is no more comment and question, it's almost 5 p.m. here in Tokyo and also in Korea. And let's wrap up this webinar. And I would like to express my gratitude to all panelists, speakers, keynote speakers for their contribution and for their interesting presentations, and also to the attendees for participating and also asking questions. So I hope that we continue these webinars for other interesting topics soon. And thank you very much for your participation. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Farhad. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Dr. G. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you
you,
very
sir.
much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Bye. Goodbye.